Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar of 2024. This is part of our recurring series, Decoding Psychosocial Risks in the Workplace. Today, we will be discussing ways to manage and adapt to change in the workplace. But before we dive into it, I would like to share a bit about our organization and what is it that we do here at IHR Australia. For those familiar faces who've been with us throughout this journey, thank you for your continued commitment and support. And to our new participants, let me introduce IHR Australia. We take pride in being Australia's experts in crafting tailored, high impact workplace solutions. For 25 years, we've been supporting leading Australian organizations with our comprehensive services, including workplace investigations, mediations, training, and outsourced HR. Our unique training approach, including our workplace reality theater experience that involves professional actors, has really set us apart in this industry. But back to today's webinar. Since this is our last session for 2024, yes, you heard us right, it's the last session for this year, but stay tuned because we do have some fresh topics coming on in 2025. Since this is our last session, I encourage everyone to ask questions, share your thoughts, and participate fully. If you can see the Q&A box below, feel free to post your questions, and I might pick a couple of them towards the end of our webinar today, which is the Q&A segment, to ask those questions to our experts. We're really looking forward to an insightful discussion today. Great, let's get started. Can I have the second slide up on the screen, please? Wonderful. We've got a great set of questions lined up. We'll start off by understanding what is change and how does it have a psychological impact on employees. The second question focuses on change management in itself and its impact on productivity and performance. Following this question, we look at the role of leadership in initiating a seamless organizational culture shift. We're also going to have two of our professional actors joining us somewhere in between the questions to put forth a really meaningful role play. So please stay tuned for that. The fourth question talks about how to address the negative impact of change management on psychological well-being. And we'll conclude the webinar with a Q&A segment that's solely dedicated for our audience members today. Wonderful. Before I bring on our experts, I do want to direct everyone's attention to our YouTube channel, which is at IHR Oz, where you can access all our previous webinars for free. You can watch all the webinars and also gain a deeper understanding of all the legal obligations for employers. So feel free to visit our YouTube channel to learn more. Great. I think I've done enough talking for today. I am super thrilled to be bringing on Bronwyn Dennis, our change management expert and our senior facilitator. And joining Bronwyn today is Stephen Booker, our consulting psychologist. Hello, Bronwyn. Hello, Stephen. How are you guys doing today?
Hello, Stephen. Hope everyone's well.
Good morning, guys. Well, thanks.
I'm doing great. So Stephen and Bronwyn, you're both based in Sydney, if I'm correct?
That's correct.
Is the weather treating you better than how it's treating me here in Melbourne?
It's been quite warm over the last few days and very muggy. So usual, typical Sydney weather.
Okay, so it's not, the story's pretty much the same in Melbourne as well. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. We're discussing quite a universal, I think, topic. Everyone goes through change every day, but we're talking about how that change sort of impacts employees and what can employers do to initiate smooth change management within the organization. So I'm going to jump straight into the questions and start off with the first one, which is what is change and how does it have a psychological impact on employees? Stephen, would you like to start off with this one?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Manasa. I guess, today we're particularly talking about significant change. And so we could probably define that as any sort of significant change or alteration in the environment, the structure, the processes, or the practices of an organization. So we're sort of talking around changes that might be happening to technological systems, leadership practices or processes, the policies of an organization, changes that might be affecting the culture of a company or the roles or jobs that exist inside it. And certainly we're talking about major changes to operational processes and business processes in an organization. I guess part of the work that we do at IHR around psychosocial risks is we're really taking a psychological approach to these matters and really trying to help employers with their risk assessment processes by giving them an objective way of measuring and benchmarking psychosocial risks in an organization and deciding which ones need action. So today I'm going to be taking a psychological approach. And I guess if we ask the question, how does change, or particularly poorly managed change, have a negative impact on employees, right? Why is it that the safety regulators around Australia have defined poorly managed change as one of these risks to employee mental health, which they call psychosocial risks, that employers need to be, measuring and assessing and consulting with employees about to deciding if they need to act? And the reason why the regulators have defined that is that most large-scale changes are really out of the control of employees, particularly those at the front line who aren't involved in making the decision about whether this change should happen, and probably might not have any involvement in how will the change actually be implemented, even at my level where it affects me personally in terms of the work I do. So from a psychological point of view, we would say that that type of change is what we'd call an uncontrollable stressor. It's something in our working life that we just don't have any control over. And research tells us that as humans, when we're exposed to things that we have no control over, think about COVID, for example, that is more stressful for us than challenges in our life or work that we have some control over. So we do see in the research a lot more negative physical and mental health outcomes are happening for people when they're exposed to these uncontrollable stresses. And so there is a pretty strong association between being faced with uncontrollable stresses like, poorly managed change and the activation of what we call our flight and fight response, the stress response in our body. And that's one of the main reasons why there's this negative psychological effect. And just finally, before I hand over to Bronwyn, a couple of other reasons. One is that if change is not implemented well, it tends to create another couple of these psychosocial risks, like it can result in employees having a lack of role clarity because, maybe changes in processes or jobs have resulted in the situation where people are less clear about what their tasks are or how the work they're doing might relate and, influence the work other teams or divisions are doing. Also, you see that the risk of low job control really escalates in a lot of cases from poorly managed change. And in our own psychosocial survey work, we do find that those risks are often associated with poorly managed change. And we know that those psychosocial risks also create stressors, for employees. And so the final thing I'll say is that we do offer psychosocial risk training at IHR, and one of the things we really focus on in that is helping leaders understand the signs of psychosocial risks at a team or individual employee level and knowing how to do early intervention. Bronwyn?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Stephen. A really good overview there of what the impacts of poorly managed change can be on individuals and particularly risks for organisations as well. And I think it's important for us, as many of the people in the audience will be, either as managers, HR or change practitioners supporting change, that we are aware of the psychosocial risks that can arise from that poor change management, which looks at unclear communication, unrealistic workloads, or, insufficient support during those transitions. Change is somewhat of a constant in our lives, though, particularly in our work lives. John F. Kennedy said that change is the law of life. and those that only look to the past or the present are sure to miss the future. So equipping ourselves, our organisations and our teams to embrace change and to manage change well can lead to progress and to greater employee engagement and well-being. McKinsey did a paper recently on change management in government, and they outlined 5 factors that will increase the likelihood of success for transformation. And those 5 factors are having a committed leadership, having a clear purpose and priorities, the cadence and coordination of the delivery, the compelling communication, and a capability for change. And I just want to share an example of what I think is one of the most successful change processes we've seen in government in the last decade. I'm from, as Manasa said earlier, I'm from Sydney, so this is a New South Wales example, talking about the development of the Service New South Wales model. I don't know if anyone recalls back in the day when you had to get your licence renewed, you had to go along to what we here in New South Wales called the RMS, the Roads and Maritime Service, and you used to have to go to some little brick building in the middle of nowhere, line up and get a ticket and talk to somebody that was behind a glass or plexiglass wall. And there wasn't a lot of customer service focus in that exchange. And so about 10 years ago, the concept of having a one-stop shop for service delivery in New South Wales was born. And Dr. Rachna Gandhi, who was a technology executive and eventually became the CEO of Service New South Wales, was responsible for that transformation. And a lot of the things that she attributed the success of that transformation to, and it was very large transformation and a very successful one, does hark back to some of those 5 principles that McKinsey talked about. One was articulating the DNA of what Service New South Wales was about. So being very clear about what the shift was and what it needed to look like. And so having that very clear vision and purpose. The compelling communication, so really articulating that purpose to the staff to get them to buy into the need for change. Creating dissatisfaction with the status quo, with the way that service delivery was being provided, to get staff to buy into the need for that change. There was a cadence on delivery. There was no compromise on being outcome focused. They had a 6-month timeline to implement this change. And so their delivery tranche was every 6 weeks and then iterate to the next step. And then the capability for change. Service New South Wales went from having a baseline of customer satisfaction of under 60% to a sustained average over 5 years of 97%. And they've maintained that average pretty much ever since. And I think one of the critical things for me in noting that is they did that with 70% of the staff that had worked in the previous iteration. So developing that groundswell from within the staff of embracing and supporting that change.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you, Stephen. That was a really detailed explanation and also a great case study to sort of kickstart the first question. Since we've also established what change is and its sort of psychological impact on employees and the importance of bringing employees on the journey from the get-go, I wanted to understand a bit more about industries or job roles that are at high risk. Stephen, could you maybe shed some light on how frequent or common is sort of the risks involved when there's poorly executed change management in certain industries?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll do my best. I just want to quickly comment on that awesome case study that Bronwyn gave us, because I'm from New South Wales as well. And if I think about the change that happened with Service New South Wales, it's probably the best example I can think of in my own personal life of how transformative an organisation that had well-managed change is, right? Walking into Service New South Wales now is like, well, you know you're going to get good service. It's still busy and rushed, but it's such a big change to where it was. It's a great example. Manasa, as you'll remember, in our first few psychosocial risk webinars, we talked about things like high job demands and low job control. And we're able to find some really great data comparing and contrasting the rates of those risks across different industries and occupations. Surprisingly, given how common the risk of poor change management is, it's actually harder to find that data in the research. An often quoted figure, if you go Googling around for how often does change fail, is that 70% of all changes fail. But like a lot of these often quoted figures, when you actually look at the scientific literature and say, well, who actually found that or where did it come from? It sort of tends to evaporate into thin air. And one reason I think is that it's hard to generalize what makes a successful change because it's quite context and industry dependent. In my own experience as someone who's been running employee engagement surveys and focus group on engagement and other workplace matters for a couple of decades now, frustrations from employees with change definitely rank as one of the top 3 things that I consistently hear and see in the data. And my own more recent work for IHR in the benchmarking of psychosocial risks is reinforcing that the psychosocial risk of poor change is a common issue. I think the best way to answer that is that there's some Monash University data where they surveyed 2,500 workers using a tool called the Copenhagen Psychosocial Risk Questionnaire. One of the scales in that questionnaire measures predictability, which in English means how well informed and how much control do employees feel they have over change. And the average score on that, the Australian benchmark, is a score that's 6 out of 10, which in English means that it's somewhere between sometimes and often they feel they do have control over change. So, but somewhere between sometimes to often is what the typical Australian employee thinks is their level of good change management, I guess we could say. Bronwyn?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Look, again, my background is government, and I think there's some statistics around the success of change management in government organisations. So that McKinsey that I spoke about before undertook a survey of around about 3,000 public officials across 18 countries, and they found that 80% of government efforts to transform unfortunately fail to meet all of their objectives. So similar to that 70% figure there that Stephen spoke about. And again, interestingly, talking about that impact of change on individuals or the perception of change. In New South Wales, we do an annual survey of the public sector workforce. It's called the People Matter Employee Engagement Survey. There's 300,000 employees in New South Wales government, so it's a pretty broad sample. And they often ask what people's experience of is change management. In New South Wales in 2023, only 39% of employees felt that change was managed well in their organisation. The Victorian Public Service has similar figures at 43%. And then a recent Gartner survey found that whilst in 2016, 74% of employees were willing to support organisational change, that's dropped to 38%. In 2022. So that's quite a significant drop. I think that extreme change that we've had through COVID has probably certainly exacerbated that figure. And again, now we've got that change coming where we're transitioning back more into the workplace. So that may well impact some of those figures there.
Very interesting data there. Thank you, Stephen and Bronwyn. And for all our attendees, I wanted to quickly highlight that we will be sending out all the sort of further reading material and resources post the webinar. So when you receive the full webinar recording, you'll also get access to all the sort of references that our experts are talking about today. So yeah, stay tuned for that email. Moving on, I got this really amazing question here about productivity and performance. And I think one of the things that when change management is not done in the most efficient or the right way, the first 2 things that take a big hit is the productivity and performance of employees. So Stephen, I'll start off with you again on this one. What are your thoughts around this specific question?
Thanks very much, Manasa. And again, I'll approach it from a psychological point of view and then hand over to Bronwyn. Looking at the psych research, there is a clear link between poorly managed change and reduced productivity. The percentage reduction that poor managed change has on productivity, efficiency, and performance in the various studies that are in the reference list range somewhere from about 15 to 50%. One thing is clear that these decreases are typically temporary. So, the better managed change is and the better support that's provided to employees to help them cope with and embed changes, the more quickly you'll come through that valley of change and reduce these impacts on performance productivity. So that's really important. It is also interesting, though, that the data does say that the impacts of anticipated change can sometimes be as great as the impacts of actually implemented change, which is why it's so important to set change up for success from the start. From a psychological point of view, we could ask the question, so why is poorly managed change affecting productivity and performance? And it comes back to what I said earlier about it being an uncontrollable stressor. That's increasing stress. And in particular, we think what's happening is that the area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is basically the part of the brain that's handling things like planning, decision-making, and emotional regulation, is being impacted by stress. And so that can make particularly some people who are facing poorly managed change become a little bit more reactive. Maybe they're thinking less clearly. They might be making more mistakes. And I think that is part, but not all of, what we typically see when we think about the concept of change resistance. And I guess as someone who's previously worked as a counsellor in employee assistance programs and had employees struggling with change and worked with them at an individual level, quite often what you see is that some of their thoughts or perceptions about the change can become very black and white or very cynical. They might have a view that there's no point in this change. It'll never work. Nothing good will come from it. And that is a black and white perspective. The reality of life so often is that things aren't either perfect or hopeless. They usually end up somewhere in the middle. So you can see for some employees struggling with poorly managed change how that impact on the prefrontal cortex is occurring. The final thing I wanted to say is that the other reason why there can be an impact on performance and productivity from poorly managed change is because, as I said earlier, it tends to be linked with some other psychosocial risks like high job demands or a lack of role clarity, which themselves have a clear link in the research between performance and productivity. Bronwyn?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think just reflecting on this question, I think for us, particularly for those on the call and the webinar that are from that sort of HR or change background, often we approach change on from that perspective of how can we support employees, how do we address that risk of psychosocial health or well-being of our employees. But often the executive or our leadership will be looking at things more from that productivity or performance of the organization. So it can be really good to have, some sort of understanding of that so that we can also bring that to the table when we're talking to the executive around the importance of having well managed change. Safe Work Australia does recognise poorly managed change as a major psychosocial hazard. And they highlight that change management issues, such as some of the things that Stephen's spoken about there, the lack of role clarity, increased job demands, and poor leadership support, do sort of contribute to elevated stress levels among employees. We also know that psychological injuries, which can be triggered by poor management, require 3 times more time off than physical injuries in the workplace, which obviously does compound the impact on business performance. In 2021, Safe Work Australia noted that around $543 million in workers' compensation claims were related to work-induced mental health conditions, and poor management of change being identified as a contributing factor. Obviously, another outcome, I guess, of poorly managed change can also be that the change that you're implementing isn't successful, and that can have an impact on the organization's productivity or performance. One really sort of probably fairly well-known example of a change that was implemented fairly poorly was Queensland's health implementation of a new payroll system in 2010. So that system went live in March 2010, despite there being known issues with the system, incomplete testing of the system. Almost 78,000 Queensland Health staff received either inaccurate pay or no pay at all for a number of months due to some of those serious system defects. Now, some of the reasons for obviously going ahead was political pressure to deliver, delivering on timeframes. There was lack of stakeholder engagement, particularly from the end users. There wasn't attention paid to some of the defects that were being raised. Decisions were made to push on despite those defects. There was inadequate training for employees on the new system, and there was a failure to address some of those risks in advance. Now, ultimately, the cost of that to the Queensland government was an end-to-end project cost of an extra $181 million, with an estimated cost to repair, maintain, and upgrade that system ultimately over 8 years being $1.2 billion. So quite a significant impact there, obviously, on productivity for the organisation, but also, when you have staff not getting paid, everyone knows from HR, the golden rule is you always make sure your employees get paid. And so when you have employees not being paid, their engagement and productivity probably is a little bit impacted as a result of that as well.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for diving deep into that case study. I think it gave all our audience a sense of just what that sort of poorly handled change management looks like in a real world scenario. Great. So Stephen and Bronwyn, I'm going to give both of you a little bit of break. And all the audience members, this is time to be alert because we've got two of our professional actors, Dave and Emily, joining us today. We've got an interaction between both of them. They'll be talking about the introduction of a new AI app in their organization and what went wrong, what went right. And let's just understand the conversation between both of them. Dave and Emily, take it away.
Hi, Emily. How have you been?
Well, thank you. You?
I've been good, thanks. And thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. So I've had a chance to review the survey results, and I saw that you had some questions and concerns about our new AI chatbot, Medi AI, which we've been trialing. So I'd love to, just hear your thoughts. If you could walk me through what's on your mind.
Yeah, look, I mean, thanks, Dave. So I do appreciate the effort to streamline our processes, and I can see how the bot can help reduce workload. However, in the last 3 months, I've noticed a few issues. And I guess one of the main concerns I have is that the bot sometimes struggles with more complex inquiries. It often ends up transferring calls that feel repetitive or unnecessary, which can create more work on our end and slow down overall performance.
Okay, well, that's completely understandable. It sounds like rather than lightening the load, it's actually adding to it in some cases. So do you maybe have an example of the kinds of inquiries where this happens?
Sure. I mean, when there are inquiries about product availability or dosage instructions, the bot seems to handle those questions pretty well. But it's the more technical questions where the bot transfers the call without much clarification. And by the time I get the call, I often have to re-clarify everything, which makes the customer even more frustrated.
Right, okay. Well, that's a very valid concern. We certainly don't want the bot to mismanage customer expectations, especially when it comes to the more sensitive topics. So it sounds like there's probably some room for improvement in how the bot handles the more nuanced questions, yeah?
Exactly. It's also a bit slow sometimes in processing. I've actually had a few customers mention that they were frustrated waiting for the bot to understand their query.
I see. Okay, well, we do want to avoid customers coming to you already frustrated because that would just defeat the purpose. And it sounds like a quicker response time and a better handling of technical queries would help you a lot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think if the bot had a better understanding of technical questions or maybe a way to identify them more effectively, it would be a lot more helpful. And if there was a faster transfer for complex cases, that might reduce waiting time for customers.
Right. Okay, well, that's really great feedback, Emily. Thank you for being so specific because that always helps us. So here's what we'll do. I'll get in touch with IT and see how we can integrate more specific product knowledge into the chatbot's database, and maybe also add a more efficient escalation protocol as well for the complex inquiries. I'll also organize some training sessions to make sure that after the bot's initial interaction, that you and your team are well prepared to handle the transitions more smoothly, and that way you're not having to play catch up for too long.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great, Dave. I do think the chatbot has potential. It's just those few areas that need fine tuning. And I think with proper training, it could help us manage things a lot better.
I agree. So, yeah, Emily, thank you for sharing your insights. I'll keep you in the loop as we make these changes. And yeah, let's reassess in the next phase of the trial.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking my concerns into consideration, Dave.
Of course, Emily. And don't hesitate to reach out if something else comes to mind.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Dave and Emily. That was a very pleasant conversation to watch. Back to Bronwyn and Stephen, what did you both think about that interaction? Can we unpack this role play?
Yeah, look, I think for me, if we think back to those McKinsey's 5 factors that I spoke about before, we do see a number of those. There's obviously a committed leader. We have a manager that's got open and clear lines of communication with the staff member and is willing to, listen to their concerns. There's a clear purpose and priorities in bringing the conversation back to, the impact on both the customer and the frontline workers, and then a follow through in terms of next steps and what we're going to do to resolve the issue that shows that cadence and coordination in delivery.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it there, Bronwyn. And it's just such a great example of how our workplace reality theatre concept that we use during our training really brings these concepts to light in a practical way for leaders and attendees. We can talk about theory, it's important to understand it, but I think, it's just so important to have practical skill-based role-play oriented training. And that's absolutely what we're doing in our training, whether it's around leadership or harassment or psychosocial risks. It's using the actors to really give the leaders skills for early intervention.
Thank you, Stephen. And Bronwyn, I might bring you on for this next question, which is really about understanding the role of a leader in sort of initiating a smooth organization culture shift. And as someone who facilitates most of our leadership training programs, I think this might be an apt one for you. So what are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, thanks, Manasa. Look, we do, obviously, as Manasa says, we do a lot of training for managers and leaders. I'm probably going to focus here a little bit more on the role of the manager, because I think, ultimately when we're implementing change, managers are just not that facilitators of the change, but they are absolutely critical to its success. We have our leaders that will set the vision, the big picture, the high level, but it's the managers that are between that vision and the employees and the implementation, and so they do serve as that bridge between between the two. And I think it's managers, and we talk about this absolutely through our custodians of culture training. Managers are the ones that have the biggest influence on how employees experience the workplace culture, which obviously impacts on employee engagement. They're the primary point of contact for employees. They're the ones that have the most influence on their daily experience in the workplace. Their role in communicating that vision that comes from above, being able to listen to concerns that their staff have, being able to offer support, as we've spoken about, can play a big role in how employees will respond to the change. The other element for me of managers around that concept of workplace culture is, as custodians, as drivers of that culture, cultures will have a big impact on what is it our culture says about acceptance or resistance to change. And so, again, that role that they have there in setting that workplace culture. The second is managing resistance to change. So managers are best positioned, they understand their teams the best, they're best positioned to be able to identify those early signs of resistance, knowing how individual employees will react to the changes, knowing just about them and being able to address their concerns, provide reassurance, involve them in that decision making is a really important aspect of leadership. Obviously, and again, this is an important element for us through custodians of culture, the role that managers have in role modeling and accountability. So setting that tone for the change, for the new culture, for the new process, modeling the desired behaviours of the organisation. Employees look to their managers for cues on how to adapt. When managers support and champion the change, it signals that new direction is not just a mandate from above, but is a shared commitment across all levels of the organisation. And that accountability reinforces the concept that the change is both necessary and beneficial for the individual or for the organisation. And then just maintaining that cadence of performance through change. Managers are responsible for managing productivity. We've spoken about how that poorly managed change can impact performance, but by being there to clarify roles, reduce uncertainty, offering that support and help, we can make sure that sort of performance is maintained and that psychological stress experienced by the employees might be reduced through their efforts.
Well said, Bronwyn. Thank you for that explanation. I'll shift my focus to Stephen, if that's okay with you, Stephen. I've got a question about how to address the negative impact of change management on psychological well-being. And just for our audience, this will be our final question, and then I'll be opening it up to the Q&A segment. Sorry, back to you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Manasa. And I think Bronwyn's given us a really great insight into the key strategies at the leadership level. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the change design process, how it is that we're actually making decisions around which aspects of our structure, our processes, our policies, or our systems should be changed. And from a psychological point of view, given what I've said already about change as an uncontrollable stressor, the research says the most important thing we can do to minimize its impacts on stress and mental ill health is to try to boost the level of control or even perceived control that employees have in the change design process. We know that increased control does have a significant prediction of reduced rates of mental ill health and sick leave and all the things that can go wrong from poorly managed change. So how do we do that in practical terms? I guess it would be around the people designing the change, stating a broad vision for the outcome state that they're trying to achieve, but then really giving the employees who are actually going to be affected by the changes more of an input into the way the change is designed. And the research says that when you do that, you're actually boosting engagement and ownership with the change because the frontline people who are going to be affected by it actually have a role in designing how the change will affect them, or at least how it will be implemented. And that really gives them more ownership and buy-in to the changes. So let's make this practical by using a case study. And for me, it's a case study that I saw early in my career as a consultant. I was doing a lot of consulting work for Australia Post in Sydney. And at one point, they opened a large new letter sorting facility, the warehouse where the mail comes in and it's sorted before being delivered. And they were integrating 5 separate mail sorting deliveries into one big one. So if you can imagine the challenge of the employees, the equipment, the system processes, the policies, pretty much everything from 5 separate locations being integrated into one. And the senior leaders there were very clever because instead of going into a room just with some change design experts and working all this out and then coming out to the workforce and saying, this is the change, they formed a cross-functional group of people at every different level and from every different functional area, but particularly emphasizing those on the front line, the actual people sorting the mail who are going to be affected by these changes. And of course, they had guidance from executives from the HR and safety teams and change management, but they really empowered the people who are actually going to be affected by the change to have a role in its design. And I can remember walking around the facility, in the months after that change was implemented and really seeing a sense of pride and ownership in some of the frontline employees who I met from while doing different consulting work. Often they would say, how great it was to have been involved in that process and how enthusiastic they were around it. And I know that they did get great engagement survey results in the months after that change. But let's be real, right? Not every change will be one where I can really empower employees to have a lot of control or ownership of the actual change design process. So for leaders, I guess, a psychological technique is one that comes really from counseling and psychotherapy, where we talk about this concept of zones of control. We talk about this idea that when I'm faced with an uncontrollable situation, there'll be some aspects of it that are completely out of my control, some that are somewhat in my control, and some over which I have a lot of control. And a simple example of that is the cost of living crisis that is affecting so many of us. if I'm spending most of my time reading, watching the news, doom scrolling around Reserve Bank decisions or economic factors, it can make me feel like I'm really out of control, right? Those are things that I've got no influence over. They're affecting me. It can be quite stressful to spend a lot of time thinking about them. But if I ask myself, what can I actually do in this situation? If I'm focusing on preparing a budget, finding lower cost alternatives, thinking about how I'm spending my money, while I can't save everything by doing that, it actually leads to a greater sense of empowerment. So I guess the final point is, if I'm a leader and my team is affected by change over which they have low control, particularly if I hear them talking a lot about the reasons for the change, questioning those, being critical around them, sure, it's important to address that honestly. But another thing I can do is try to reorient a little bit of that conversation to, yep, I get it, I hear it, I feel that way too, but I'm confident we can resolve this. Let's start by asking what's actually in our control. And sometimes all that might actually be in our control is making sure that we're fully and properly informed about the change and thinking through how it's going to affect us at the team level and what we can start to do to prepare to handle that impact. Back to you, Manasa.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that wraps up all the questions I had for the both of you today, but we do have some interesting questions from our audience members. So let's move on to the Q&A round. We've got some questions already that our attendees have submitted in our registration form. So I will be prioritizing those, and then I'll pick some of the questions from our Q&A box if time allows us to do so today. Starting off with the first question, we've got an attendee asking, how do you support psychosocial health following a major workplace restructure?
Yeah, thanks, Manasa. I think this is a great question, and often people's experience of workplace change is where there has been a restructure or change to job roles, and it can be a very stressful time for people. Stressful if they're worried about job security and they might lose their job, but it's still stressful for even the people that are left behind after a restructure. So I think this is a great question. So when we implement a change management program, the end of the sort of day that we go live shouldn't be the end of the change management support. There'll be an adjustment period after we implement a new structure where people are getting used to new roles, maybe new ways of working, even, maybe new people in the team. So what I would say is we need to make sure that we still continue to listen. We still need to maintain those channels or avenues that we have for people to be able to provide feedback, focusing on how the change are going. Are we meeting those expected benefits, or do we need to, revisit some of the changes? We need to make sure that we're keeping that development and training up. For a whole variety of reasons, some people might not have engaged with the support that's available to them during the change period. They might have been skeptical that the change was going to happen. They might have been busy. They might have been resistant. So we need to make sure that training and support is still available to them even after the restructure has been implemented, so that they still have that opportunity to learn those new skills. Whatever support that we've had in place during the restructuring, during the change period, we should make sure that that's still available, whether that's the EAP, the people and culture support team. Just promote that that's still available to people. I think reflecting and changing, being open to acknowledging that we got it wrong if something isn't working, and moving quickly to adjust it if needed. I always say that the one of the biggest mistakes that we can make is not to make a decision. But because if we make a decision and we can see that we've got it wrong, then it gives us the opportunity to, make the next decision. And so sometimes, particularly if something's been somebody's vision or someone's program, there's a little bit of a reluctance to acknowledge that something maybe hasn't gone as well as people expected. But I think we need to be open to acknowledging that. Celebrate success, of course, talk about the wins, what's going well, acknowledging where teams or people have adjusted to the change and celebrating that. And then just, of course, generally as a sort of delivery cadence, monitoring the workload and expectations during that new period, acknowledging and recognising that there's an additional mental load in learning new tasks, operating in new teams, meeting new people, and that our expectations around delivery and performance might just need to be adjusted throughout that transition period.
Great response, Bronwyn. Thank you for that. The next question here is, so we did talk a lot about managing change and making employees comfortable and bringing them on the journey. But this attendee here wanted to understand some effective change management strategies with change at senior management and executive levels. Stephen?
It's a really good question, and as Bronwyn has sort of highlighted, culture flows from the top, right? So while I think a lot of the methods for addressing change and having successful change that we've talked about already are equally applicable and important at the senior executive level, how well we engage senior executives and managers is really critical, isn't it? Because if they're not bought into the change, if they're not championing it, it's going to make it a lot harder. And that message that, hey, I'm not on board with this change will really flow through all the levels of the organization. So what are some specific challenges for good change management at their senior management and executive level, particularly if they're not the designers or owners of change? I guess one is that, like many employees who might have been with an organization for a long time, they may have quite ingrained beliefs due to many years of experience. They may see change as threats to their status or their competence or their legacy, or they may have limited available time and bandwidth to engage as a stakeholder with the people that are actually designing and driving the change. But again, the sort of techniques that are going to address that are pretty much similar to, what helps manage change well at all levels. Demonstrate how the change benefits them personally, such as enhancing leadership effectiveness or KPIs that they might be responsible for. Use market trends and case studies to grab their attention and effectively use that limited bandwidth or time they might have. Give them a compelling reason for why the change makes sense. When you can, just as I was saying earlier, engage them in the design and implementation process to build their ownership, and if possible, assign leadership roles for them in that change design or implementation process.
Thank you, Stephen. And before we go on with our next question, I think we'll have room for just one more. I wanted to just respond to one of our attendees' question about, will the recording be available after the session? Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out the recording and all the further reading materials and resources for you to be able to access at any point. So just look out for our email. We'll be sending it in a couple of days, and maybe 1 or 2 days after the webinar has been completed. So I hope that helps. So back to Stephen and Bronwyn, I've got this question from our Q&A box today. An attendee is asking, why do employers change rosters or make major workplace changes without consultation? It's a legal requirement under the WHS Act. Is it from lack of knowledge of legislation or clear ignorance? And they say they ask nicely.
Look, I think we talk about. I talk about this a lot when I do custodians of culture training. That there's, we talk about a gap between intent and impact. And when I talk about that, I talk about the fact that when we come to work, we're made up of a whole bunch of different factors. We're made up of our generation, our age, our culture, our gender, our work experiences, all of those sorts of things. And managers are as well. Leaders are as well. And so, yes, for some of them, it is just lack of knowledge. If it's a smaller business, if they've been running in a particular way for a long time, they may feel that they need to, not consult with people. We have different leadership styles. So some people are very outcomes-focused leaders and might see consultation as taking time and those sorts of things. So I think it can be both a lack of knowledge, it can be differences in leadership styles. Ultimately, though, obviously, if somebody is implementing changes that they're doing that without consultation, they'll lose their workforce, because people aren't going to stick around if they're not being consulted, if an organisation's having a negative impact on them, if their experience of the culture impacts their health. People will vote with their feet, and so it will impact the business ultimately. What I would say in those situations, it would be great where CEOs or leaders had trusted advisors that could get in their ear to sort of point out to them, not only is it just a requirement of the Act, but that it does have an impact on their workforce, on productivity, on their performance. If they have a board, encouraging the board to get a bit more proactive in that space of calling out the CEO around how they are responding to that need for change.
Stephen, did you have any thoughts around this question?
Not a great deal. I think that's a really awesome answer. It's, I guess, hard to generalize across, many different organizations. I think all the factors that Bronwyn have mentioned are probably at play to a greater or lesser degree in each organization. I think the only thing I'll add is that well-managed change is a time-consuming and or costly process. It requires a lot of resourcing, either internally or externally. And hey, let's be real, right? Organizations are always facing multiple competing pressures. And sometimes I think one of the reasons why the consultation isn't great is because the amount of time and effort that's going to require to do change well maybe just doesn't exist or hasn't been fully understood.
Well said. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Bronwyn. I think just there's one more question, and Stephen, they're asking you that you refer to research a lot. Do you recommend any specific articles, maybe in this area? Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm not a change management expert. My experience is more around measuring and benchmarking psychosocial risks and knowing how to intervene. So I won't put myself forward as someone who's got a fantastic knowledge of change management strategy literature. But one really great free resource I did find was the University of Berkeley in California's free guide to change management. There's a link to it in our resources list, or certainly the reference is listed there. And when I was reading in preparation for this webinar, I just found it was a great practical, business-focused resource on change management. So that'd be my top pick.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we've got about 8 minutes. Bronwyn, is it okay if I just squeeze one more question in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
So we did get another question about when fostering intergenerational work relationships, what are some ways to facilitate a positive workplace interaction and collaboration? I thought this might be a good one for you.
Yeah. Look, as I just said before, when we come to work, we're all different. And I think sometimes humanness, we have this sort of tendency to assume that everybody thinks that the way that we do, or that they're all going to react to a situation the way that we would react. And of course, that is not the case, because we all have that inner self. And so when we implement changes in the workplace, obviously, often we are dealing with people from very different backgrounds. And that includes age here, talking about intergenerational workforce, but it will include different learning styles, different ways of processing information, different reactions to change. And again, it's all a factor of who we are. So it's important that we design change approaches that allow for those differences, and that also don't contribute to conflict by pitting one generation against the other. Often we make assumptions or stereotype people based off those characteristics, and sometimes when we celebrate success, it might be saying that we're celebrating younger workers over older workers, or vice versa. So we need to make sure that we're not doing that. I think some of the ways that we can do this is by making sure we tailor our communication styles to different audiences. It's very easy to just whip out the newsletter, but again, we need to make sure that we have multiple ways of people to gather that information. We need to listen to multiple voices. So we've talked about involving employees in that decision making and the change process. Make sure that we're getting that input from a multiplicity of groups. Get input on what support they need. It will be different for different people. Try to make sure that we are, when we have things like change champions, that we get the people that are most resistant. I always say, if you can convince the most resistant person in the organization of the change, if you're listening to what their concerns are, then that's going to be more successful. And address that resistance with compassion. Often when we're the manager or the change leader, we've been dealing with the change for a long time. We're much further along the change continuum of acceptance. When we first talk to people about change, they're at a very different level, and it's the first time they're hearing about it. People will have different concerns and different reasons for how they react. So allow people time to process, listen to their concerns. Don't just treat somebody saying, oh, this won't work, as being resistance. I was involved in a change management program for the property advisory group It was around workplace. We were moving from fixed ways of working to activity-based working, changing location. But we also had different cultures coming together into a new organisation. We had older engineering type workers who were very used to working in a fixed way of working to very commercial property people, younger property people who were very, already sort of working quite flexibly. So, again, just making sure that we addressed some of those challenges, making sure that we had email drop boxes, change walls, all staff sessions, videos in terms of those styles of communication. Multiple ways for people to engage in the process. So of course, change champions. We had practice zones. We did scavenger hunts. We had photography competitions, a whole bunch of different things. We made sure that we had different learning approaches. So everything from lunch and learns to very visual examples. We had fly-throughs of the new space. And then the sort of traditional learning and development. And just time, making sure that we gave people time to engage with the information, process what the information meant to them, and engage in a manner that suited them, rather than just saying this is our change approach and this is how we're going to do it.
Thank you, Bronwyn. And you mentioned a lot about managing that resistance to change. So I did mention that I won't be asking any more questions, but we did receive a great bunch of questions. So Stephen, I'm going to trouble you one final time. I know you had some tips around managing resistance. Would you mind sharing those under 3 minutes? Oh, sorry, Stephen, you're on mute.
Oh, I fell into the classic mute trap. I was hoping I wouldn't do that. Thank you, Manasa. I'm really happy to comment on that. And indeed, what I'm going to say, I'm really just quoting from a book called How to Change Things When Change is Hard. And that is actually a book that the University of Berkeley guide I spoke about extracts a lot of information from. So that University of Berkeley guide is great. Look, it's pretty common, I think, and often said in change resistance strategies, right? The more choices available, the more ambiguous the path. So the desired state's got to be made crystal clear. The ambiguous goals have to be translated into concrete behavioral goals to help people cope with change. You've got to provide a near-term, vivid picture of an all or nothing goal which shows what could be possible. You've got to describe a compelling destination that prevents people from getting lost in analysis. And you've got to find the bright spots, right? Direct people that are expressing change resistance towards workable solutions by finding and analyzing exceptions to the problems they're raising. And the final point, and Bronwyn's mentioned it already with all the great examples she gave, use change champions, engage respected people who can advocate for the change and influence their peers.
Great. Thank you again, Stephen and Bronwyn. That brings us to the end of our final webinar of 2024. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for staying till the very end, and for also asking such important questions around change management. If you'd like to learn more about our webinars, our upcoming webinars in 2025, workshops, and HR support services, feel free to visit our website. Again, I would like to reiterate what we do here at IHR Australia. We've been supporting leading organizations with a range of comprehensive services, including workplace investigations, mediations, training, and outsource HR. So if you do come into one of our leadership training, you might bump into Bronwyn. And if you do attend our psychosocial risks training, you will definitely meet Stephen Booker there. And I'm assuming also the workplace investigations, Stephen, if I'm correct?
Yeah, that's right, Manasa.
Wonderful. And also, if all our attendees can quickly scan the QR code and tell us about your experience today, we would love to hear your thoughts and, of course, take your feedback into consideration to improve our future webinars. And in terms of our future webinars, stay tuned for updates because we do have a great lineup of topics for the new year. And before I wrap up, I do want to express my gratitude to our incredible team, our experts, professional actors, and the technical support staff who have been instrumental in bringing all these webinars to life. I am quite emotional since this is our final webinar of the year. But everyone, please to have a great break because we'll be back in 2025 with some same great presenters and great topics. Thank you all.